Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. Each week, we are serving up motivation and inspiration to help you get weeknight dinner on the table, letting you recapture a little calm in the crazy. And now, your host, speaker, author, and married mother of four, Mariefiebach.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast, episode 101. I'm your host, Mariefiebach, and I am so happy to be here with you today. Today, we're going to talk about, does your family like to eat soup? I have to admit that I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable, and I'm going to tell you that my family, not the biggest fans of soup. Now, today's podcast isn't going to be a big rant about how my family doesn't like soup. I've got some tips and tricks for you that I have used to help my family eat soup a little bit better. But I just want to be honest with you. If you are like me and it's fall and you're thinking, ooh, it's time for soup, and your family is not the biggest fans, you're not alone. I think that sometimes we have ideals in our head of how our family should eat or how we want our family to eat. And sometimes expectations and reality are not the same. And it can be really hard when you're trying to manage feeding a family, looking at budgets and deciding how you can feed your family well and as economically as possible. And soup is what all of the frugal bloggers will say. My friend Steph Jenkins, she runs the blog, The Cheapskate Cook, and I follow her on Instagram. And she feeds her family soup like at least once a week, often way more than that. Usually she's feeding soup several times a week. And it is one of her key strategies for making the most out of ingredients. And soup can be really budget friendly if you are making your own bone broth and you're reusing your vegetable scraps and all of those frugal ideas, which is totally great and I totally admire. But when I translate that to my family, they get a little frustrated. In episode 75, I talked about the emotional burden of feeding your family, and I told a story in there about how we get our beef from a local farmer, and that means that we get the beef bones. And I don't want those to go to waste, and I like homemade beef soup. And so I intentionally made a big pot of homemade beef soup, and I knew that my husband was very particular, and so I was very, very selective, and I picked out all of the pieces of meat that were not very fatty, and I served it to him with the beef soup, and he kind of rejected it, and it kind of hurt my feelings, and I felt really upset. My husband is very loving and very caring and was not trying to hurt my feelings. It was just one of those situations, but it was part of that emotional burden of feeding your family. If you want to hear more about that, you can check out episode 75 because I talk about that a little bit. Soup is one of those kind of trigger things in our house that I love soup. I have one of my daughters who absolutely loves soup, but when I try and feed it to the family as a whole, I'm often met with some resistance. So here's the thing. I like soup. Soup is usually a pretty healthy food. I mean, if you have it laden with cream and cheese, it's probably not the healthiest. But for the most part, soup is considered healthy, and it's also usually really budget friendly. It's a good way to stretch meat a little bit further and to get a little bit more vegetables into your family. But in my house, soup on a regular basis doesn't work really well. And I kind of go back to one of my key principles at Feed Your Family Tonight. And that is what my family is going to eat is not necessarily the same as what your family's going to eat. You may be listening to this episode thinking, I don't know what she's talking about. My family gobbles up soup. It's their favorite thing in the fall, and we look forward to it. And if that's you, I am so excited for you because that is the dream of my family. But for now, it's not my reality. And I'm not saying that's going to be my reality forever, but it kind of is for now. But that doesn't stop me from making soup. So I want to give you a little bit of encouragement out there if you're one of those families where your kids are like, we're having soup? Really, Mom? I have some things that will help you. The first thing is, even if my family is not the biggest fan, I still make soup. But I make some accommodations to make soup be a little bit more palatable to my family. The first accommodation that I make is I always serve it with something really loaded with carbs. I've got a teenage boy. I've got kids that love carbs. And so when I make soup, I can't just serve a soup unless I serve soup that is loaded with carbs or serve some kind of a hunk of carbs on the side. We eat a lot of chicken noodle soup, and my family actually tolerates that one pretty well. Often I'll make that with just a box of dried noodles. And my trick for that is to cook your noodles separate from the chicken broth. Otherwise, the noodles will soak up all of the chicken broth. I like to cook the noodles on the side, and sometimes I add some of my homemade veggie bouillon, or I will even cook it in like a box of chicken broth, or I'll just cook them in nicely salted water. But I always recommend when you're making chicken noodle soup to cook your noodles on the side and then mix it with the soup later. That way the noodles don't absorb up all of the broth. So I'll make dried noodles. My son has discovered this wonderful thing called frozen Reams noodles, and they are like what you would make for like chicken and noodles. So they're big and they're thick and they're really carby. And my son loves the carby Reams noodles. I have tried to make a homemade version of them, and I think they taste absolutely lovely, but my children will often reject those. So I have just taken to going to the shortcut and buying several bags of those frozen Reams noodles when I do some deep dive grocery shopping, so I can pull them out quickly and make chicken noodle soup whenever I have the hankering to make chicken noodle soup, or when I need a really quick meal. Chicken noodle soup is one of my go-to backup meals. And that's the other thing, is serving a backup meal on a night where the whole family knows that we're running from place to place. They tend to not complain as much because we're often not having as much time to sit down and have nice long discussions over the dinner table. And I don't know about you, but sometimes those nice long discussions can be a chance for my children to become food critics, and they will say, well, this would be better if you did this, or I don't really like this. So serving it on the right night is another kind of little trick. Is if you're serving soup on a night when you're really busy and everybody's rushing in and just trying to grab a bite to eat, then they will tend to complain a little bit less. Some of my other favorite ways to add something carby to soup is if we make something like chili. I will make cornbread along the side. I often will make my homemade beer bread, and that recipe is coming to the blog soon, so watch for it because it's really simple. It has just a few ingredients and it cooks rather quickly. You don't have to let it rise or anything. But I'll make a homemade beer bread, and my family will serve that with butter or jam or honey, and that kind of tends to take the edge off the fact that we're having soup for dinner. I've also taken to like making homemade biscuits. You could even open up a can of refrigerated biscuits or make up a batch of Bisquick. It doesn't have to be totally homemade, but serving some type of a bread or some type of a carb alongside the soup sometimes helps my family. I have said before that my family is very carnivorous. And so a lot of times when I'm making soup, I try and make soup that has a lot of meat in it. So when I make a vegetable beef soup and I am roasting the bones, I will often roast another small piece of meat, like a little piece of round steak or something alongside it, so that I know that I have extra meat to put into the soup. And again, that kind of defies the whole making soup budget friendly. But the reality is my family's going to complain, and I really don't want to fix a dinner that my family's going to complain about. So if I have an extra little piece of round steak or something in my freezer, I will happily roast that up and add it to the soup so that I get fewer complaints. I do the same when I make my roast chicken and then I make bone broth. When I roast chickens, I always roast at least 2 chickens and sometimes even 3, and then we'll eat most of one for the first night. I will take all of the meat off the bones and put it into meal-sized portions for my family. And then I will take the bones and put them in my crock pot and put some veggies and garlic and a few spices and put that in my crock pot covered with water and let it cook on low for about 24 hours. And you end up with this really rich, thick chicken broth. But my meal-sized portions of meat that go into my chicken noodle soup that I keep in baggies in the freezer have a lot of chicken meat. And so when we have chicken noodle soup, there are members of my family that I kind of don't give them any of the broth. I just give them the noodles and the chicken meat in a bowl, and it might have, a douse of broth on it, and they can call it chicken noodle soup, but really they're just eating meat and noodles. And that's okay with me. Again, sometimes, especially with kids, is you just have to get them exposed to foods, and they will expand the more they are exposed to them. And I feel that way with soup, is that sometimes I just make it and that's just how it's going to be. And I will accommodate as much as I can by giving them more of the things they like and less of the things that they don't. If I am making a chicken tortilla soup, I definitely will have a lot of chicken in there. And then I will serve it with lots of tortilla chips. And sometimes, again, to take the edge off that I'm making soup for dinner, I will take some of those tortilla chips and cover them in shredded cheese and put them under the broiler for a couple minutes. And then we kind of have nachos and chicken tortilla soup. My last little trick for serving soup to families that are reluctant is to serve it alongside a sandwich. Again, I do this especially when I'm making something like a creamy soup that doesn't have any meat in it. So I have an Asian carrot soup recipe up on the blog that I absolutely love. It's vegan. It has coconut milk and peanut butter and carrots and soy sauce and garlic in it. And oh my gosh, I absolutely love it. And one of my daughters could eat it by the vat. Like, she absolutely loves this soup too. So if I'm going to make that Asian carrot soup, I will always serve it alongside sandwiches for dinner. And sometimes I will make like a grilled sandwich, like a hot ham and cheese, and I will grill it on my griddle so that it's crispy and the cheese gets all melty. Or I'll make just a plain grilled cheese sandwich. I have a tomato soup that I really like, and I'll make a tomato soup. And even the family members that don't prefer soup, they'll dunk a sandwich in a small little cup of tomato soup or even a small little cup of the carrot soup. I get to have a big bowl of soup and a little sandwich, and they have a big sandwich and a little bowl of soup, and it all works out. And it's totally fine. When you are feeding a family that has lots of different tastes, there are so many of you that say it's so hard because everybody's picky or has special diets, or you're dealing with allergies or food intolerances. It's about learning to make the dinners work. Sometimes that means that different people in your family are having different portions of the same food. So if I'm making a vegetable beef soup, I've got one kid that's having mostly meat and vegetables. I've got another kid that's having mostly noodles with a little bit of meat and won't touch the vegetables. I've got one kid that's having a bowl of mostly broth. They'll have a little bit of meat and a little bit of vegetables and a little bit of the noodles, but it all just kind of depends on each kid. As parents, that's part of that emotional burden where we're trying to portion out the food according to each of our children's needs. And soup is just a really good example of that, where you have lots of different ingredients in the same dish, and you can kind of separate it out according to what the different people in your family need and also what they prefer. So if you've got a family that someone's trying to be keto and someone else basically lives off of carbs, then you can make a simple soup that has a lot of meat and vegetables in it with the broth, and you can serve the meat and the vegetables to the person who is being keto. And then you can have noodles, and you can add that to noodles and a little bit of extra meat, and your kid that doesn't like the veggies so much can eat a bowl full of noodles and meat. Soup is one of those dinners that you do have ways that you can adapt it. And again, I'm always serving some type of a bread or carb alongside it. But if you've got someone who's keto, which I don't right now, but I know there's lots of families that are really facing that situation. If you have someone who's keto, they just don't eat the bread. And you've got this soup that has lots of meat and lots of vegetables, and that's what they can eat for dinner. And then everybody else can kind of eat the bread and whatever little bits of the soup that they like. I really believe at Feed Your Family Tonight that it's about making dinner work for your family, and our families are all different. So if you're like me and your family is not a big fan of soup, I just want to let you know that that's okay. For a long time, I kind of felt really guilty. I felt like I'd kind of failed as a mom that I hadn't taught my kids to love soup when they were little. I'm realizing now that that isn't the case. I haven't failed as a mom because my kids don't like soup. I am still working to expand their palates, and I'm also the person who has to manage the family budget. And sometimes we have to dig into foods that we will eat but aren't our favorites. And that's a tough lesson to learn in life, but it's something that I'm trying to teach my kids. And I hope that as my kids get older and they start leaving the nest, while they may be really, really picky when they're underneath my house, I suspect that they'll learn to be a little bit more frugal when they're cooking for themselves. And I kind of think that they're going to come back to some of the more frugal meals that I've made that weren't their favorite, but they might learn to make them anyway because they've been exposed to them. When you're feeding children, so much of it is about just exposing them to foods over and over and over again. When my kids were little, I would have a rule that they didn't have to eat it, but they had to look at it. I would always put it on their plate just a little bit. And they didn't have to eat it. They had to look at it. That is an exposure to food. And it's just kind of a way of teaching your kids that it's okay if you don't like something, but that isn't going to stop mom from making it. Now, my final little tip for soups, especially if you're like me, and you love soup and your family is not a big fan, I will often make a big pot of soup at the beginning of the week and I will eat it for my lunches. I make all sorts of different soups for my lunches. One of my favorite kinds of soup to make is just a cream of whatever vegetable I have left in the fridge. So I will make a little white sauce with a little bit of butter and a little bit of flour, and I will add some veggie broth and a little bit of milk and make this creamy soup. And then I will add whatever leftover roasted veggies I have. Right now I've got some roasted beets that are in my refrigerator, and I suspect that's probably going to be my breakfast for tomorrow, which is a roasted beet soup. I will eat it for breakfast. I will eat it for lunch. Or I'll make like a big batch of tomato soup or a big batch of that Asian carrot soup, and I will freeze it in mason jars. And my daughter, who loves soup, and I will both just pull a mason jar out of the freezer and heat it up in the microwave and have that soup for lunches. So it makes a really quick, fast, and easy lunch. My girl who loves soup is a teenager, and right now with her school situation, she is home at like 11:15 every day. So she's eating lunch at home every day. And so having those soups in the freezer for her has been a really nice thing when she's been home for lunches. She doesn't have to interrupt me or ask what's for lunch. She can just go and help herself to one of the soups that I've made in the freezer. So I eat a lot of soups for breakfast and I eat them for lunch. And that way I get the soup that I love and I don't feel like I'm having to force soup upon my family. Although I do make it for them and I still make soup and I'm going to continue making soup. But remember, if your family isn't a fan of soup, try adding some carbs. Try portioning out the ingredients of the soup according to the tastes of the people you are serving. And when in doubt, just make it for yourself for lunch. So I hope I've given you some encouragement, especially for those of you who are like me, who like soup, want to make more soups because they're so budget friendly, but your family's a little bit resistant. As we head into the winter and soup season and you start seeing beautiful recipes for soup, do not be discouraged. Make it for yourself or find a way to adapt it to your family's tastes. For now, friends, thanks so much for joining us on the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. I want to hear if your family likes soup or doesn't like soup. And I'm going to ask that question in the Feed Your Family Tonight Facebook group. And I cannot wait to hear your answers because I'm wondering how many of you are like me. Again, I'm just me, and you may have families that love soup, and I hope you do. But if you don't, that's fine too. So join me in the Feed Your Family Tonight Facebook group, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Feed Your Family Tonight podcast with your host, Mariefiebach. If you like the show and want to know more, please visit feedyourfamilytonight.com. And if you'd like to help support the show, please leave a rating or review on iTunes or Apple Podcast. It helps spread the word that you can feed your family tonight.